Welcome to ISCT's webinar titled Challenges and Potential Solutions for Taking Your Cell and Gene Therapy Clinical Program to Japan. I'm David Smith, your chair today for the webinar, the first of a two-part series actually on Japan that we've created in the ISCT Business Models and Investment Subcommittee in support of the Memorandum of Understanding collaboration that was recently signed between FIRM in Japan and the ISCT, which actually happened in October earlier this year. This new collaboration is to facilitate cell and gene therapy knowledge and awareness of opportunities in Japan. So we're proud to present this first webinar sponsored by Hitachi Chemical Advanced Therapeutic Solutions, formerly PCT. Our speakers for today's webinar are Colin Novick, Kazuchika Furuishi and Robert Preti, and they will focus on regulatory and manufacturing considerations for taking your cell and gene therapy projects to Japan. For ISCT's second webinar, which will be held in the Q2 2018, the focus will be on partnering and collaboration with Japan's cell and gene therapy industry. So as I mentioned, I'm David Smith and currently lead the Innovation and Engineering Center at Hitachi Chemical Advanced Therapeutic Solutions from our East Coast site. The center has the ambition to develop and provide novel technology solutions in order to realize commercial success of cell therapies. And before joining the company back in 2015, I completed a PhD at Loughborough University in regenerative medicine, and prior to this, a master in biochemical engineering from the University of Bath, both of which in the UK. So as an introduction to our speakers, the first that we'll have today will be Colin Novick, who, as an American raised in Japan, graduated from Japanese public schools to study at Cornell University. After working as a management consultant at Deloitte Tohamasu Consulting for 3 years, Colin moved to SMBC Nikko Securities, where he facilitated M&A activity. In 2012, Colin and a cross-cultural colleague, Jason Seeger, founded CJ Partners, where they provide consultancy and advisory services with a heavy regenerative medicine focus. Over the years, Colin has presented at multiple industry events on various regenerative medicine topics, assisted multiple Japanese pharmaceutical firms in certain specific areas of interest in regenerative medicine, and facilitated numerous biotechs and bioventures engaged with both Japanese regulators and potential partners and investors. So it's fair to say he's well versed in the requirements being asked of our cell and gene therapy providers trying to move into Japan. Following Colin's talk, we'll hear from Dr. Kazuchika Furuishi, who is a Deputy General Manager of the Regenerative Medicine Business Sector at Hitachi Chemical. He's responsible for the launch and management of Hitachi Chemical's newly constructed cell therapy CDMO facility in Yokohama, Japan. He's worked in business management roles in the biosciences industry for 17 years. Kaz will highlight some of the crucial differences in raw material and equipment challenges that face cell and gene therapy providers. Our final speaker will be Dr. Robert Preti, who is the Chief Executive Officer and President of, as well as co-founder of the visionary behind Hitachi Chemical Advanced Therapeutic Solution, formerly PCT. Bob founded PCT almost 20 years ago to meet a recognized need for high-quality manufacturing and development services in the emerging cell therapy industry. On PCT's acquisition to Hitachi Chemical in May 2017, Bob's role expanded to General Manager of the Regenerative Medicine Business Sector of Hitachi Chemical, responsible for development management and oversight of the global business operations of Hitachi Chemical's Regenerative Medicine Business Unit. Bob is currently Chairman for the Alliance of Regenerative Medicine, where he has previously served in a variety of roles. Bob received his PhD in biology from New York University and will address some of the common pitfalls that have previously hampered efforts to move into Japan successfully. I'm noticing in the participant feedback there's a number of people that cannot hear, operator. Is there anything that we can do to address these problems?
Unfortunately, if they're unable to hear over the web, I am not able to assist on that. However, you can provide them with the audio telephone number and passcode to call in as a participant, and they can join via phone lines.
Megan, would you be able to provide that number to everybody, please?
Yes, I will provide the dial-in number into the chat box for all participants.
Thank you, Megan. I guess before we get started anyway, I'd like to allow our conference operator to briefly go over the format for today's conference.
Absolutely. There will be 2 parts, a 45-minute presentation segment and a 15-minute Q&A session. Today's webinar will be recorded and available to participants after the webinar. In order to stay within the allotted time frame, all phone lines, except those of the presenter, will be placed on a mute only during the presentation. This will not prevent you from asking questions during the presentation. You may post written questions throughout the presentation by using the chat box located to the left side of the slides. After the presentation has been completed, all questions will be addressed during the subsequent Q&A session. We will address the written questions first and then take any additional questions by phone.
Thank you, operator. Hopefully you will see now in the feedback a number in case you or your colleagues cannot hear us, another way to dial in. I guess maybe we'll pause just for 10-20 seconds here just to let those people who cannot hear have another chance to dial in before beginning. Perfect. Hopefully a number of people that couldn't hear previously are now able to as we get to the main body of the event now. I'd like to hand over to Colin Novick of CJ Partners to begin our presentation. Thank you, Colin.
Thank you very much, David. Can everyone hear me okay? I hope so. I'm going to start by just mentioning that I've got a number of slides to get through in about 15 minutes to do so. So if you do have any questions, please wait to ask them towards the end or as already discussed in the participant feedback. And by all means, please do let us know afterwards if you need to ask any questions as well. I've already skipped ahead to the first slide of my presentation. And some of you may already understand this, but prior to the enactment of the new Japanese regulatory regulations, there were a number of different ways to get your clinical trial up and running or to get your regenerative medicine or cellular therapy up and running here in Japan. And for most of us here, the methodology that was most frequently used would be the clinical trials methodology. And you can see on the bottom right-hand side of this slide here that the 2 products that were approved immediately after Japan passed their new regulations, the allogeneic MSC GVHD treatment, JCR Pharmaceuticals, also Mesoblast product, and also the heart sheet, autologous skeletal myoblast sheet, Terumo, were already in clinical trials at the time that the regulations changed. And so basically on November 27, 2013, the Japanese government basically passed the laws and said that they would put them in force within 1 year. And both laws came into force the following year on November 25, 2014. I won't spend too much time on this slide and go immediately into what those 2 laws are. They are basically the Act on the Safety of Regenerative Medicine, which was a new law passed, and then the revision of the Pharmaceutical Affairs Act, which then became the PMD Act. Now, I think importantly, we're going to focus more on the PMD Act because that one has the conditional approval, which has garnered a lot of interest in bringing your product to Japan. But to provide a little bit more of a background, I think some of the key definitions when you're reading the PMD Act are the definition of regenerative medical product and conditional approval. So when you are looking at regenerative medical product or the definition within the law, it stipulates that medicinal products produced by corporate entities for an unspecified large number of people that's involved. And then it raises these three things. And, you know, this is kind of more kind of a legal methodology of saying 3 things. Basically, it covers gene therapies, cell therapies, and tissue engineering. Now, for conditional approval, you've heard probably a lot about this, a system of approval that was put in place specifically for regenerative medical products, and that basically fall within the following three categories. They don't have any major safety concerns, they are able to show probable efficaciousness, and they are not homologous. Now, in addition to those, there are a number of other conditions that will be put in place if you are able to obtain conditional approval. One of the bigger ones is that you are going to be given up to 7 years to be able to obtain more information about your study prior to reapplying. This conditional approval covers all cell therapies, and we'll touch upon that a little bit more further on in the presentation. But taking a closer look now at conditional approval, when you look over at the right-hand side of this slide here, you'll generally start with your preclinical, phase 1 clinical trial, and then you'll have a number of chances to proceed to conditional sales and manufacturing approval. That could potentially happen after your phase 1 clinical trial. It could potentially happen after your phase 2 clinical trial. And if you're almost there after a phase 3 clinical trial, you could also potentially get it after your phase 3 clinical trial. One of those trials has to be conducted in Japan. So just be aware of that. You're not going to be able to get conditional approval based solely off of foreign data. And after you receive conditional marketing, sales, and approval, they'll give you a specific number of years. You'll be able to provide your regenerative medical product at a select few Japanese hospitals. And then after that specific set number of years, or within that time period, you will have to reapply for sales and manufacturing approval, which kind of brings you down back to the regular location of your clinical development and approval process. I cannot stress how important it is to get in touch with the PMDA from a very early stage and start discussing what sort of product you have, what sort of data you have, and what it is that you're planning to do. They are very, very forthcoming with providing you with assistance and help in what exactly it will be that you'll need to do to get your product closer to being approved either fully or conditionally in Japan. And this is an important piece because it allows you to get to the market a lot faster in what is essentially the world's second largest pharmaceutical market. So for biotechs especially, it provides them with an opportunity to generate more revenue. And I say this because anything that's approved in Japan underneath a conditional sales and manufacturing approval or under full sales and manufacturing approval, everything will be covered by the Japanese NHI drug price insurance, which means the government pays for 70% of whatever it is that the price that's determined for your product is. So, taking a bird's eye view of what exactly that means, I've got a slide title here that says revolutionary conditional approval. But when you look at, a regular clinical development process, you need to obtain adequate safety. You then need to also obtain acceptable efficaciousness, and then only after that you are able to and I've got the end signs here to kind of indicate that you're allowed to start selling your product. But these hurdles that you need to clear, the clinical development, as we all know, costs a significant amount of capital outlay. Now, what happens for conditional approval in Japan is they lowered that standard acceptable efficaciousness hurdle to the same level as the standard acceptable efficaciousness for orphan drugs. It's important to note that they're not saying you have to be orphan. They're just saying that they're just borrowing this hurdle so they didn't have to revise another law. So as long as you can provide the same level of acceptable efficaciousness that you would for an orphan drug, for whatever the indication may be, you have a chance of qualifying for conditional approval. And what that basically does is it flips what is the most expensive portion of your clinical trial process into a revenue-generating opportunity that's underwritten by the Japanese health reimbursement system. That, in my book, is revolutionary, and I don't see it in any other jurisdiction at this moment. To kind of summarize a little bit the significance of Japan's regulatory system, I just want to touch upon these 6 items. Basically, Japan to this day is still the second largest pharmaceutical market in the world, and by doing these regulatory changes, it's a very clear signal that, and also by firm teaming up with IFCT and other organizations, it's a very clear signal that Japan wants to open up their doors to foreign companies to participate in what they're trying to construct here for regenerative medical products. It's also important to note that under the Japanese PMD Act, if you do run your clinical trials and obtain either conditional or full approval, again, without exception, all products are covered by Japanese government reimbursement at 70%. Japanese patients will pay the remaining 30% out of pocket, but it's also important to note that at the year end, there are some tax rebatable costs for anything that's even expensive, like only paying 30%. So, even if your price tag in Japan is relatively high, the out-of-pocket expenses to the average patient is not going to be as high as it might be in other jurisdictions. It's also important to note that because of this system, it's basically the Japanese taxpayer and not the company that's funding the research under the conditionally approved period. And it reduces the need to conduct large-scale and expensive phase 3 clinical trials. If anybody wants to know how prices work in Japan for regenerative medical products for the foreseeable future, they're going to be priced using the cost-plus method. We can talk about that if anyone has any questions about it a little bit later, but just note that there is a methodology. It's a pretty straightforward methodology, once you can wrap your head around all the variables, and it's used to determine what exactly the price will be. So even from a modeling perspective, that helps biotechs prepare. I'd like to move on to take a little bit of a look at the kind of support network when you do come to Japan and you start engaging with the PMDA to try to bring your clinical program to the archipelago here. There is a very wide support network that you should be aware of, and I'd just like to start with kind of the government, academia, and industry network that's here for support. This is just a little bit of a sidetrack, but the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry and the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare, they usually don't get along, but seeing them on the same slide alongside the Ministry of Education and Culture and so on and so forth, basically is very rare. And that's because the Cabinet Office of the Abe administration, alongside the larger Japanese government right now, has basically gotten these disparate ministries to sit down next to each other and make sure that this is a common goal for the government. So the Prime Minister's Cabinet Office, 3 influential ministries, and all support Japan's regulatory body. You only really have to worry about MEX if you've got an ESC product, but if not, focus primarily on these 2 here. And of course the PMDA. There's also the Japan Society for Regenerative Medicine for academia, and there are currently over 100 universities that are actively conducting clinical research in regenerative medicine, and it's important to kind of pinpoint which doctors you're going to be talking to when you try to bring your clinical program to Japan. And then, of course, there's also the Forum for Innovative Regenerative Medicine, which, as of September 2017, had over 230 companies participating and multiple relationships with overseas entities, IFCT included. And they're all supporting the Japanese regenerative medicine market. And just to give you an idea, regardless of what it is that your problem or your issue is, there are companies that can help you out here. For instance, we're presenting today with Hitachi Chemical, but they're part of the manufacturing group of companies that are here in Japan. There are also multiple CROs, SMOs, if you need some help for recruiting, a serious plethora of pharmaceutical companies, also distribution companies, and a whole host of other companies that are interested in conducting and participating in regenerative medicine efforts. So just make sure you keep an open mind of how you're going to enter Japan, both from a clinical development perspective, because the conditional approval process is relatively new and still evolving, but also from a business perspective. Make sure you keep all doors open. It's also important to note that there are 2 locations whereby the municipal governments, primarily Kobe and Kanagawa, that are surrounding the greater Tokyo area strategic special zone and also the Osaka, Kyoto, Kobe strategic special zone that are opening up their doors for Japanese regenerative medicine industry. And this is pretty much the case for almost any successful Japanese industry, but manufacturing companies play a very, very important role. So making sure that you are engaged with the right manufacturing company can in many ways help your product in Japan, not just from a regulatory engagement and ensuring that you've got the correct manufacturing quality, but also, and we can talk about this more maybe in the Q2 session from a pricing perspective, because it is the cost plus method, and you're going to want to have a good idea of what your costs are, and the manufacturing companies, including Hitachi, can help out on that front. And finally, just to conclude, just some key factors that you should be aware of when thinking about Japan and participating and bringing a clinical program to Japan is that they have a stated goal of trying to create the global capital for regenerative medicine, and they're pushing forward with it quite aggressively. The engagement with the PMDA is going to be very important, but in addition to that, it's also important to understand these 5 highlights. There is a lot of government support in academic research and industry participation, so keep that in mind when you're looking for answers. Also, there's a large and growing manufacturing base for cell and gene therapies, and they're backed by the municipal government strategic special zones. Keep that in mind as well when you start to proceed and try to figure out what's the best option for you when you're bringing your product to Japan. There is a very large base of pharmaceutical companies, medical device companies, chemical companies, cosmetics companies, trading house companies that are all looking, and they're also, some of them are competing with each other to get the best regenerative medicine technologies. So make sure that you explore. There are going to be a lot of companies that you probably never even heard of that are doing this type of work, but they are, to use a cliche, they're big in Japan. There are also a large number of technology innovators that are based primarily in academic institutions that could potentially help, a biotech company when they're trying to enter Japan. So think about that as well. And then finally, there is an active and ongoing in-licensing environment for promising cell and gene therapies that's taking place in Japan. So think about that. When is it that you want to start partnering up in Japan? Do you want to run a clinical trial first, or do you want to have them help you run a clinical trial? It's possible to sponsor your own clinical trial and have an in-country clinical caretaker do your trial, or you can team up like a company like Athersys did with Helios and have a Japanese company be your sponsor. Either way, there are multiple areas to consider. It is an exciting market to participate in, especially if you are a cellular therapy company. And I'd be happy to answer more questions later on in the presentation, but for the time being, I'm going to turn it back to the organizer, to the chairperson, David. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colin. It's a great overview. I now welcome our second speaker, Kazuchika Furushi, to continue our webinar. Thank you, Kaz. Over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, David. So as Colin provided the high-level understanding for new regulation in Japan, I also would like to add some points from the manufacturer partner or CMO point of view for this. So as I said, now we have 2 acts that were enacted on 25th November 2014. So before that, the product developer wouldn't allow to use a CMO for the manufacturing partner in Japan. After the new legislation were enacted, there are, as you can see, there are 2 types of the act. The one is the Act on the Safety of Regenerative Medicine, which is controlled by the Ministry of Health, Labor, Welfare. All medical technologies using proceeds, so which safety and efficacy have not been yet established. So this is fully controlled under Medical Practitioner Act. So the other one is the revision of the Pharmaceutical Affairs Law, which called the PMD Act. So now we are, that is proceed 100% by the PMDA, like as other medical products, pharmaceutical, medical devices. Next slide, please. So that is the high-level scheme of the new conditional approval, which can be easily understandable. So the upper chart is the traditional approval process. So in general, everybody says that it might take the 10 years plus in Japan to get approval. The bottom chart is to explain about a new scheme for regenerative medicine for the conditional approval process. So after phase 2, so the product developer might get conditional or term limited authorization from PMDA, and then the manufacturer could market or sell their product in Japan like as commercial product. So the considering point as a developer, the manufacturing process might need to be considered and controlled as commercial product from phase 2, because after getting the conditional and term limited authorization, that is fully controlled like as commercial product. Then within max 7 years, the product developer needs to reapply to the PMDA to get the full approval, like as other pharmaceutical or medical devices. Next slide, please. So this is the big difference regarding the raw material here in Japan. So basically, we couldn't obtain any raw materials for off-the-shelf cell therapy for the commercial purpose because of they are regulated by other regulation related to the handling the blood or transportation, etc. And underneath there are I pointed to there are some difference between the different concept from the U.S. for standard for human cell and the tissue materials. Basically, of course, the donor needs to be a consent, and who must be appropriately qualified to donate the cell or tissues, especially for the off-the-shelf cell therapy product. When the relevant cells or tissues are collected, the interviews, examinations, and tests must rule out infection by bacteria, fungi, virus, etc., like HIV, HTLV, type 1, type 3, HVV, HVC, and parvovirus, according to the intended use of the collected source material. The test item and the method for step A above must be appropriate in light of the latest available information regarding the infectious disease. The last one is a big difference from other regions. Depending on the test items and the method for step A, there must be retesting performed in appropriate time frame with consideration made for the window periods. So most of the existing master cell bank for the off-the-shelf cell therapy products in worldwide, there might some, but the most of the master cell bank wouldn't retest donor itself by considering this Windows build, that means that Master 7 couldn't bring into Japan to use the clinical trial in Japan. That's what I have learned from my experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaz. That was great. Now welcome our third speaker, Robert Preti, to continue the theme of issues that we're seeing and differences and pitfalls. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Kaz. Pleasure to be here today with you all. So we're going to start talking about taking this from the budgeting perspective, and what we've found is to maybe added cost and maybe slightly different, and what might be somewhat the same. And just keep in mind as we're doing this, as we go through this, that we're learning these experiences as we go. We've had the experience now of dealing with the Japanese regulatory environment and trying to get products set up there through our customer base for about 3 years now. And now that we are part of the Hitachi Chemical Corporation and we're setting up our facility in Yokohama together, we're getting a lot of experience that's much more granular. And some of the learnings are that the biggest cost difference that we've seen so far between North America and Japan is that the CRO costs tend to be a little bit higher. This may change over time, and we may be able to find some arrangements that are different. And if there are people on the call that can shed light on it, it would be interesting. But in general, CRO costs tend to be higher, and not just by a little bit, tend to be quite significantly higher. Other considerations which one would think about as you're taking a clinical program to Japan include those overall overarching costs, such as consulting costs. As Colin mentioned previously, there are, I don't know if there are ample services, but there are many services from which to choose, and many people, many groups and industries developing to create a platform or an environment within which this very aggressive regenerative medicine initiative can be enabled. But that does come with a cost, and that the consulting costs, particularly those who understand PMDA, can be something that has to be factored into the program. And again, that's not necessarily that they are particularly high, but they're costs that you would not normally experience when operating within your region. When we get towards the end of my part of the presentation, we'll talk a little bit about the communication issues and language issues, and that is in part why consultants are important and people on the ground. Of course, there's very practical costs such as flights, hotel, and lost time through travel. Japan and the U.S. are quite far away from each other, and in moving products from one place to the other, there is quite a bit of travel going back and forth, because there's nothing like face-to-face communication, and meetings with regulatory bodies, manufacturers, and the like should ideally be in person to the extent possible. There are translator services that are important to engage, even if it's not within the boundary of a regulatory conversation, but just in general to communicate better with each other. Typically what we find is that in speaking our native tongue, the Japanese environment, typically they do speak English, people speak English there, but the language tenor needs to change, the choice of words changes, the speed at which you speak changes, and the way you communicate changes. And in doing that, the communication sometimes drops off. And so it really is helpful to have translator services, but important to keep in mind too with the translator services is that there's as much interpreting going on as there is translating, and the translators are able to understand when people are communicating and when they may be talking at cross purposes, simply because of the differences in the choice of words that we're using and what we hear. Back again to Colin's slides that show all of the teams that you can engage in Japan. Certainly there are many of those that you can. The on-the-ground teams in Japan do provide some opportunity for expenditure of money. But in general, the manufacturing and product costs are fairly similar in terms of the people and the environment and environmental monitoring and all those normal items that go into creating the manufacturing costs, reagents and supplies, are pretty much about the same. So you can assume that the manufacturing cost basis is very much the same between the two regions. and between Europe as well. So finding the services and that actually will support you and be able to provide assistance for you. For instance, we have identified one validation services in Japan are very, very difficult to find. And these will, again, back to what Colin was saying, these will be added in as time goes by and as these gaps are recognized. Companies will absolutely jump in to fill the gap. At the moment, there are problems finding certain types of vendors. And so some of the work has to be done yourselves. We have an advantage in being part of such a large company that within our company, within Hitachi Chemical, and within the larger Hitachi group, there are many of these types of services that exist and we can leverage them. But finding these services out on the open market can be difficult and they can slow down the development. But ultimately, you can prevail if you just have the right people on the ground to help you sort through. And this goes back to working with partners, of course, but just consider the time that it takes to get those partners. It's also important to recognize that when you're working with the Japanese, there's this consensus decision-making approach, which is actually when enabled properly doesn't really slow you down, but coming in as Westerners into the environment and learning how to access that environment and how to move decisions along can actually slow the process down. And so we're finding that you can add a third or even a half as much time to the timeline to develop a program in the U.S., partly because the environment is just coming together and partly because we are learning how to work within that environment. With respect to trying to move this along, communication, language, and cultural differences just need to be recognized. And the collaborative relationship that you need to take will help with the communication, language, and cultural differences. But there's a real spirit of mutuality that needs to occur with the understanding that on both sides, the understanding on the side of the Japanese partner as well as the developer coming in from another region, that these are differences that will exist and we need to work collaboratively to get beyond them. The challenges that you may face in this include time zone challenges. There are 13 time zones apart. I mentioned previously the culture differences, the way that we are able to communicate with each other, the language differences. The regulatory approaches are somewhat different, although the regulatory people are talking to each other and trying to standardize. There are certain aspects of a conversation with PMDA that will be stressed more, such as safety and testing of microbiological contamination and those things that are either taken for granted a bit more, certainly not considered by other regulatory agencies, but there's highlighted concern in Japan over these are items that one must keep in mind and work through. And then, of course, in the reimbursement environment is different, but with the right approach. It's, as Colin mentioned, it is a cost-plus arrangement, and once you understand those costs and develop the program with that in mind, that you keep careful track of the costs, you can develop a reimbursement scheme quite easily. And so finally, as what we're learning is that the way to solve the communication, language, and culture differences is to establish what we call a third culture. And we're able to do that in our firm by spending an awful lot of time thinking through what is the difference, what's the bridge we have to cross, and how can we find that third culture. That is the advantage to coming to partners that have already harmonized their platforms so that you don't have to do that as well, but it's something to keep in mind as a solution. It's really important to have face-to-face communication, as I mentioned before, and leverage as much as possible any communication technology such as video conferencing when travel is not possible, and to stress this concept of mutuality. It's also really important to have a mindset of positive intent and be very transparent. If we openly acknowledge the differences and commit to working on them, we have found that we can facilitate and move through quite easily where communication challenges can cause misunderstandings about intent. And then finally, leveraging partners who have bridged this gap to support global consistency for therapeutic development is important.
Perfect. So I don't see any that have come into the Q&A, so we're now ready to take questions by telephone. And oh no, hold up! Before we do that, see one from Anna that's just come in. What is the requirement to perform testing in Japan?
So Anna, is this a question? This is Bob. Is this a question related to bacterial testing, to microbial testing? I see. Do you need additional testing in the country? It's a good question. I would imagine that really depends on what sort of testing. I can throw this back to Kaz because he did talk a little bit about some of the viral testing. But in general, I think what PMDA would do is to look at the product and what the testing has been, and if it maps up to their idea of what is safe, then they would just approve it as is, and you wouldn't have to redo the testing. But I'm not sure. Kaz?
Hey, Bob, also, once Kaz is done, I'm actually going through this process with 3 different companies right now, so I can add a little bit after Kaz is done.
Good. God, great. Yeah. You want to start, Colin? And then
or perhaps I'll just... Sure. So you're absolutely correct, Bob, in your assessment that there are particular guidelines in Japan. One of them is the Japanese guidelines on biological raw materials. And depending upon what exactly it is that your raw material is, let's say it's human serum albumin, you're going to need to show that it adheres to the Japanese rules and standards for fractionated blood products. And you just go through each and every one of those rules and standards and show that, yes, we have conducted, serological testing on the donor for this blood. And you just need all of the COAs to prove that you've done it. You'll hear my daughter in the background. It's around 6 o'clock in the morning here, so apologies for that. But as long as you can show that you adhere to the Japanese standards and provide supporting documentation that you adhere to it, then you're okay. Oftentimes, if the documentation is many pages long, you may have to highlight for them that on page 37, read this line, and it shows that it adheres to the Japanese standard in such and such a way. But as long as you're able to do that, generally speaking, there's no retesting that you need to do in Japan.
Thank you for that, Colin. I hope that answered your question, Anna. Oh, by the looks of it, it did. Perfect. I think at this point we're now ready to take any questions by telephone, and for that I'll hand the rest of the segment over to the operator who will instruct you on how to ask a question. Thank you, everyone.
Certainly. If you would like to ask a question, please signal by pressing star 1 on your telephone keypad. If you are using a speakerphone, please make sure your mute function is turned off to allow your signal to reach our equipment. A voice prompt on your phone line will indicate when your line is open. Please state your name before posing your question. Again, please press star 1 to ask a question, and we'll pause for just a moment to allow everyone an opportunity to signal. And there are no questions from the telephone audience at this time.
Can I quickly just add
to
the
Pardon me, there is one. We did have one queue up just. Caller, your line is open.
Thank you. It's Bill calling from Steminent in San Diego and Taipei. We actually are working with a partner to take our product to a phase 2 trial in Japan. And one of the challenges has been matching raw materials from the U.S. with raw materials that are available in the USP in Japan. Any comments on how to think about or approach that?
Would you guys be okay for me to take the first stab at that one?
Fire away, Colin.
So I think in terms of raw materials, the biological raw materials are a little bit more straightforward because there are ample guidelines that just show what exactly it is that you need to adhere to. And with the number of consultations that the PMDA has been conducting on regenerative medical products over the last couple of years, they've got it down to a pretty neat science at this point. So they'll know which products need to adhere to what. You don't necessarily have to have a Japanese, let's say, human serum albumin. You can use the Baxter one. You can use the Behringer one, as long as you can show that it adheres to the guidelines. I think when you start doing to the non-biological raw materials, it becomes a little bit more difficult. Not because there's less information. There is information. It's just buried deep inside existing Japanese code. So, for instance, if you need to go in and find a specific type of excipient that you need to add as a raw material, and you need to go through and understand what sort of process-derived impurities are born out of that excipient, and you need to then classify them as metallic process-derived impurities, or biologically active, or API, or possibly poisonous or toxic. And each one of those has multiple guidelines that are already existing in the Japanese regulatory environment, that you just need to go in and find your page and make sure that you talk to that. Now, it's oftentimes very difficult because some of the companies that are currently trying to enter into regenerative medicine, they don't have experience of developing biologicals or even small molecules in some cases, in which case, a lot of these regulations are new to them. So oftentimes it just comes back down to, talking to the PMDA. And I had experience actually when I first started doing this over 5 years ago. The PMDA would, walk up to me, and they're actually very helpful. They would show us the guideline and say, this is the guideline, here's the page. Use the wording in here and prove to us that your product is safe. And ideally, you may want to. You could also potentially switch over to using a product in Japan if you're unable to adhere to the standard. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Bill, what's the nature of the material problem that you're having? Is it that the approach is different, or the standard is different?
Actually, the suppliers, in some cases, don't actually provide the product in Japan.
Oh.
So it's a matter of finding compatibility, and that's been an issue with some of the raw materials in our product.
Yeah, that's a problem in moving from any geographic area to another. We've seen that many times with our clients that we work with in Europe and the United States. So
yeah, part of the
it's really a challenge.
Searching in Japan. Most of the websites are Japanese, and some of the English sites are limited.
We found the solution once, and one of these was to approach PMDA with a master file kind of an approach. They don't have a master file system quite the same way, but we had to really work with the company, with the provider of the particular reagent, and with PMDA. And it's one of the reasons I mentioned before, having a consultant that understands PMDA, speaks the language, really understands, and there's an awful lot of talk that goes on outside of the formal meeting that can get a lot of work done on these types of issues. Because it's very, very difficult negotiations, and there has to be real clarity of purpose. And I think what Colin said is really true. It's really just a big concern about the safety of the reagents. That's really the major issue.
Yeah, agreed. It's early days, and experience is really important.
And we have a question calling from.
Hi, this is Julie Alexson from Wake Forest Institute for Regenerative Medicine. I was wondering, in regards to all the guidelines and standards, Colin, that you've been discussing, is that available in English or those are only in Japanese?
That's a good question. For the most part, they're only in Japanese. However, shameless plug, over the last 2 or 3 years, my colleagues and I have been diligently translating them. We do provide them to our clients, and when they need to understand them, they're kind of piecemeal right now because we only translate the ones that are needed for our current clients. You can find a few online. Some of them are better translated than others. For instance, there are 5 guidelines that were published in 2012. 2 have to do with iPS or pluripotent stem cells, iPSC and iPSC and iPSC-like, allogeneic and autologous. 2 have to do with somatic and somatic stem cells, allogeneic and autologous, and 1 has to do with ESCs. Those were actually published in the Japan Regenerative Medicine journal. They're kind of they make them look like articles, but I think they're just translations with a little blurb up in the front. Those are relatively well translated. Again, Japan Regenerative Medicine. Julie, I think you know my email, so I can send those to you.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
And again, that's *1 if you would like to ask a question. And there are no other questions in the queue at this time. I'll turn the conference over to you for any closing remarks.
Thank you, Alfreda. So I'd like to thank you all for joining today's webinar. The webinar evaluation will be sent out to you all via email for this presentation. Please take this opportunity to let us know if there's any future topics that would be of interest to you that the ISCT can provide. And also completion of the evaluation will provide you access to the webinar that's been recorded today. Once again, thank you for your time, especially for those that are out in Japan. I know it's early morning, so have a great day, and for those in the US, have a great evening. Thank you, everyone.
This does conclude today's conference. We thank you for your participation.